This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Welcome to another episode of the After Class Podcast. Today we'll be continuing discussion we began in a previous episode. But before we jump into it, we thought it would be important to say a few things of a pastoral nature. We've been talking about heaven and the nature of heaven, and we know that this brings up a lot of feelings and emotions for people. Grieving lost loved ones and the rest, and they're concerned for the afterlife and whether they will see them again, and all these things are bound up in it. And so we just wanted to make clear that what we're saying is working towards a biblical theology and working towards shoring up some things and getting rid of some culturally impressed things that have come into our theology of heaven. But as someone who's been a minister for many years, I understand that because I feel one way about heaven does not mean I immediately force that on someone, especially someone who's grieving. So someone who's lost a loved one, and perhaps they say, "Oh, I'm just, I can take consolation in the fact that so-and-so is with Jesus in heaven." I don't look at them and say, "No, they're not."
Yeah, you're wrong.
Right.
Exactly.
Like, no, that's not how it works.
Right. Exactly.
Because there's more important things than being right.
Yeah.
There's things like caring for people and helping them grieve and work through difficult times. Fixing theology is perhaps best left to a different situation, not the grieving period.
Yeah, that would be the absolute wrong time to have that conversation.
And, as professors, we run into this kind of thing a lot. Mm-hmm. Like a student will learn a new perspective on any given topic that they went to college for that was different than they learned in Sunday school. Yeah. And like the first freshman winter break, like the freshmen go home and tick off everyone back home. Yeah. Tick off mom, dad, siblings, anyone they can flaunt their new knowledge to in their face. And that's not where we come from.
Right.
We care about our future and what our hope is, and we want to get it right, and we want it to be biblical. But this is good news.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And we want to refine good news, and good news is not just about getting the message right; it's delivering it in a way that is sensitive and timely to where other people are coming from. So if you gain new views on heaven or afterlife from this podcast or any other topic, be sensitive, I think, in how you convey that. Be pastorally especially sensitive when people are grieving and not really screw up your relationship by attacking people's eschatologies at all the wrong times.
Right, exactly.
So.
And especially, I think, as we've already mentioned, that to remind people, even when you do have this conversation, even if it's the right place, I had an experience just recently where trying to have a conversation as we've just been having, and some people got really upset, and I didn't realize what I was treading into. And other friends were able to step in and sort of pick up some broken pieces that I left behind. Not because I was being insensitive, but I didn't realize that some people were reading some ideas into what I was saying that weren't there. They came away thinking like, we're not going to see our loved ones someday or something like that. It's like, no, that's not what I'm saying. We're going to see them. We're just going to see them on the new earth. We're going to see them at the resurrection. But there were some unspoken assumptions there that even I didn't realize that upset some people. And I think it was just illustrative of how this can go bad quickly if you're not sensitive to where people are. And so, I think we do need to be careful.
So we just wanted to put that out there before we sort of lay a foundation for what is to come as we examine more passages, as we continue our discussion of the afterlife and what heaven is and what it is not. As a reminder, there are 4 views, and these views that we brought out the first time, there's the cartoon view, as we called it, the idea of sort of a ghostly, spiritual-looking thing that rises up after death. There is the reunion view, where the spirit or soul or entity goes and hangs out in heaven and then is reunited with the body at the second coming.
The resurrection.
Stop me if I'm doing these wrong, John.
Close enough.
Close enough. Wow. That's very encouraging.
Yes.
The third one is the Daniel view, that there is this resurrection of some to everlasting life and some to eternal contempt. And then there's the split grave version, which the body remains in the grave, the soul is stored in some place, Hades, Sheol, Paradise. And
Abraham's
then
bosom.
Abraham's bosom, thank you. And then there is the resurrection of the two together when Jesus comes back. All those, no?
No, I don't think that was the split grave view. That's kind of the reunion view, what you just described. Split grave is that the grave, it's not just one common Sheol for all, that Sheol itself is subdivided into a better place for the wicked, the righteous, and a worse place for the wicked,
That's right.
and maybe a special place for the martyrs. So a subdivided grave based on how you lived.
Something like that. I would recommend going back and listen to it, and as I should. Now, we laid this out, and we went through a couple of passages. Most of them were controversial and difficult to get through, which was not John and I's intention, but Ron had other plans.
Once again, being more ironic than
Yes,
usual.
Indeed. And
Turning everything into a chaotic swarm of something that we don't want to name.
okay. Swarm? No.
Mass.
Swill? No. So, as a result, we've had a lot of feedback from people talking to us and emailing us and just continue the conversation, which we really appreciate, and we'd like to do that as well. And John wants to tackle one such response that he has gotten from a avid listener. Go ahead, John.
Shout out to Chuck Markell.
Hey, Chuck.
Senior.
Senior, for raising a question and a passage that we did not bring up. There was one exceptional passage that Ron didn't bring up last week.
Just one.
And when we talked about today you'll be with me in paradise, Jesus' words to the one of the thieves on the cross, we kicked that around a lot and what paradise could be. And Chuck reminds us that in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 2 through 4, Paul talks about someone having a vision. He refuses to identify them, but we're all suspicious it's him.
Yep.
Humble brag.
Who was caught up into paradise, and which is used synonymously with being caught up to the third heaven. And so there is that reference in 2 Corinthians, so that maybe what the thief was promised is that he would be in that third heaven in paradise, whether that is the meaning of that passage. And whether that's the best way to interpret that passage as this passage informs the other. Great question. Not one that we've never thought about, but one that we neglected to bring up. And that just made me think of it might be helpful to give a broader background to the language of paradise to know what we're getting into. If paradise that Jesus is referring to is the third layer of heaven, where does that notion even come from, that there's a layered heavens? And we tried to kind of skip doing an intertestamental literature background to this topic, and you just can't skip it.
Right.
And we're going to have to go back a little bit and kind of give you some context. I'm going to try to do it really quickly because we want to get to the rest of the New Testament passages, and we want to get to some clear baseline New Testament passages.
Do we, Ron?
Well, not if you let me lead the way, but
Correct.
John's probably the smarter one on this.
Well, we want to leave our listeners with something they can take home and feel confident in. So
You're just so much more generous than I am.
So anyway, so in giving some background, it's worth noting that many of the books in the Old Testament, or what we call the Apocrypha, that's in Catholic Bibles and other Bibles, only talk about death as going to Hades, much like most of the Old Testament does, except really for Daniel, in a clear way. So the book of Tobit, Baruch, Sirach, and First Maccabees, death is final. You go down to the grave, down to Hades, and that's the end of it. But in the 1st to 2nd century BC, we can't date this book exactly. We have a work called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. And that is kind of a farewell speech by each of Jacob's sons in a collection. And that book adds the notion of heaven as being 7 heavens, a layered heaven of 7 realms. Especially in the Testament of Levi, we get the most detail about this. So in the Testament of Levi, which is apocalyptic in nature, which we should keep in mind, not all of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs is apocalyptic by genre. The Testament of Levi is. But there is a description of 7 heavens, and in that testament, there is no human in any of those 7 heavens. And God is only in the highest heaven.
Okay.
So heaven is layered, and there are different forms of angels at different layers of the heavens, but God's abode is only in the seventh heaven.
Seventh Heaven. Great show.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I never actually watched it, but I remember the TV show.
It's not a great show.
So I was particularly curious about the description of the third heaven, since Paul talks about someone being caught up into the third heaven.
Okay, yeah.
And there is a third heaven described, and in that heaven there is a warrior angel that smites the wicked spirits of Beliar. So this is
Smiting.
This is actually a place of the punishment of Beliar would be another word for the devil in the intertestamental period, where the devil's spirits or servants receive punishment in the third heaven. So this is one possible, this is the first possible chronological reference that we have access to that I'm aware of. There could be others. If you find it, please add that to the hopper. Let us know.
That's interesting, though, that you have punishment happening not in sort of like some sort of underworld hell type situation like what we would think of, but actually in a heavenly abode where you have wicked people being punished. That's a very interesting thing.
Yep. And in the same book, Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, there is a vision of the eschaton, the end days. When the Messiah comes, he will restore the earth. He will open the gates of paradise on earth to grant... What are you doing over there, Sam? Mute your phone before the podcast.
I did. Something happened. I was looking up something and it failed.
Okay, so when the Messiah comes, he restores the earth and he opens the gates of paradise to grant the righteous access to eternal life.
Okay,
and so here is an earthly paradise, probably referring to the Garden of Eden.
Okay.
Which is how the word paradise is translated in Greek in the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the dead humans are depicted as sleeping as they await for the resurrection from the dead to new life on a restored earth. So the view of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs is that you die, you're resting, sleeping. It's kind of the Daniel view. But there's also this vision of seven heavens, but it's not a place where humans go. So it's possible that this is the background to Paul's view, that someone got caught up to a heaven, seventh heaven, not because that's where humans are or go or hang out, but because there's this belief of layered heavens, and they were able to see something that was pretty crazy. That at least Levi, in the testament of this book, has a vision of the third heaven as well, and also the first, the second, and all seven. So that's one possible use, or two possible uses, really. There's the paradise on earth in this book, and there's the paradise, and it has nothing to do with the seven heavens. So they're actually separate. Another book we might look at is 2 Maccabees. That's also in the Apocrypha. Martyrs expect to die and go to Hades. And then they expect to be raised from the dead and given new bodies. That's the baseline view. So they seem to have a Daniel view in the book of 2 Maccabees. And this is in contrast to Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a Greek ruler who fails to reach the stars of heaven and who believes that his father, who has deceased, has gone on to the gods. So the Greek in the book thinks that his deceased father has gone on to the gods in the heavens, whereas the martyrs, the heroes of the story, think that they're going to go to Hades, and they're going to wait there until the resurrection, and then they're going to get their bodies back. So that's 2 Maccabees. No mention of multiple heavens or of paradise. Then you have Luke 23. I'm just kind of going in chronological order. So Luke 23, you have the reference from Jesus, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." We hashed that out last time. It's not clear exactly where that is. Then you have the 2 Corinthians passage that Chuck brought up, 12, 2 through 4. Paul knows a man who was caught up into the third heaven, into paradise. And Paul's not sure whether it was in the body or not. And he makes that point twice.
Right, yeah.
Whether it was in the body or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
And which is really interesting.
Yep.
Then you have another reference in the book of Revelation to paradise in chapter 2, verse 7. Those who conquer, he's speaking to churches, and those who conquer their foes will be able to eat from the tree of life in paradise. We're not told where this paradise is. But then in chapters 21 and 22 of Revelation, we have a vision where there's a new heavens and a new earth, a kind of remodeling of the existing heavens and earth. And heavens and earth is a phrase that belongs together to kind of refer to the skies, and the ground we walk on. But the New Jerusalem descends to the renewed heavens and earth, and the tree of life is there.
Right. Yeah.
And so if tree of life is associated with paradise, then in Revelation, paradise is where the tree of life will be on the restored creation.
Right.
So that's another reference to what Jesus can be saying, right? Today you'll be with me in paradise, the place referred to in Revelation as being in the new heavens and new earth, which means it's going to be a while before you get there. So today may not mean what it means for people who are still walking the earth.
Right, yeah.
And then after Revelation was written, after the whole New Testament is wrapped up, we have two other passages which are kind of interesting and maybe relevant. In the book of 4th Ezra, also goes by the name 2nd Esdras. It depends how you divide up and title things. In chapter 7 of that book, there are 2 resting places in Hades. So this would be the split grave. Mm-hmm. One for the righteous and one for the wicked. The righteous are enjoying rest, and the wicked are being tormented somehow. But in chapter 4 of 4th Ezra, both paradise and hell appear on earth after Judgment Day. And
hell on earth.
Yeah, and they are opposite each other, and the righteous enter paradise, and the wicked, enter hell. So there's a split grave, and then after Judgment Day, there's split final destinations. So a split intermediate state followed by a split permanent state.
Does that just make their torment even worse because they can see the righteous partying and having a good time, and across this gulf are the wicked who are not only in torment but adding to seeing what they don't get to participate in?
Yeah. And it kind of reminds you of another exceptional passage in a parable of Jesus.
Right, the rich man and Lazarus.
The rich man Lazarus, right?
So, yeah, it's the interesting thing about that list of references you bring is that there is some diversity. I mean, what I'm hearing from it is that there's not like a necessarily. Oh, your point. There's even more you got there.
Yeah, I got more.
Holy cow! Okay, so I'm jumping the gun here. Maybe I should just let you finish.
Yeah, the diversity starts going further.
Okay. I won't jump in then.
The wisdom of Solomon, again, and these two, 4th Ezra and Wisdom of Solomon, are in the Apocrypha, so it's more mainstream Jewish stuff. The dead sleep in Hades and come back again, according to the Wisdom of Solomon. But whereas their bodies rest in clay, their souls return to God and are in His hand. So
He's got the whole dead world in His hands.
So it's interesting. What exactly is meant by souls here, and what does it mean for them to be in God's hand? Especially because there's another passage in the Wisdom of Solomon that says that those who have died hope to receive immortality, and they hope for their imprisoned souls to be released. So,
like a purgatory type situation?
Or, again, a Hades holding place, temporary abode till you get your resurrected body. Is that what it's saying?
Yeah. The souls who hope to receive immortality, they're the good ones, right? I mean,
yeah.
They're simultaneously imprisoned and in God's hand. So it's a sense that they're dead, they're waiting to return for immortality, but they're still in God's hand. Like God is caring for them in their state of death. He's looking after them.
Right.
They're in His hands. They're not floating adrift in the underworld subject to spiritual forces that could do harm to them or not. That they're in God's hand, but they're resting in Hades, kind of imprisoned, waiting for the resurrection.
Kind of like the cartoon Hercules, where all the dead souls are swirling around in the little vortex there.
If I might clarify one point for my OT3 class, it's in God's anthropomorphic hands. So
we had that conversation as well.
Yeah. All right, 4 more, and this is where it gets really crazy. So now you start to get into post-1st century AD works, and some coming out of Alexandria area where you have a lot of Greek dualism happening, and you see them happening in the text.
Is there a technical term for that period? You know, post New Testament era, like, is there any kind of technical term that I should be aware of?
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking here about Middle Platonism.
Which, I mean, everyone's familiar with the Middle Platonists.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
So
right.
the book is The Life of Adam and Eve. So it's a Jewish work, and it talks about Adam and Eve, and we talked about the life of Adam and Eve in our Satan discussion.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's in this book where things start getting a little more like the modern day notions of Satan and less like how the Bible talks about it.
Right.
But when Adam dies, his soul departs after death and begins an upward journey. Then after he begins his upward journey, he is cleansed in Lake Acheron, or Acheron. I don't know how to spell it.
Akron. It's in Ohio.
Akron? Yeah, Akron. He's cleansed in Lake Akron in God's presence. Now, in Greek mythology, you must cross this place to enter the underworld.
Oh, sounds like a little bit like the river Styx.
It's exactly like the river Styx.
Yeah.
It's another word for it. So it's interesting. His soul goes upward, but he's cleansed in a lake that's usually the place you have to go through to get to the underworld, and yet his cleansing happens in God's presence. Yeah. So affirm all that at the same time.
Yep.
And then he is taken to paradise in the third heaven. So this is exact language,
Right.
echoing Paul,
Right.
to await the future restored world.
Okay.
So this sounds a lot like the, what do we call that view? The reunion view.
Reunion view, yep.
Elsewhere, however, in the book, paradise is called a place on earth where Adam's dead body is taken, as well as the seducer. I assume that's referring to the devil. And those who follow the seducer. God speaks to Adam there, his body, and Adam's body responds. And God promises to raise him on the last day.
The zombie body.
So a lot of things going on there. And this seems to be what we call a syncretistic work. It's kind of got one part Daniel view, Jewish, one part his soul is ascending, which kind of sounds like the cartoon view. But then he's stored in the third heaven after he's cleansed in the underworld, in God's presence, in a place that's only known to Greek mythology.
Right, yeah.
So there's and again, coming out of Alexandria at this time with Middle Platonism, it seems like a hybridization of the passages, and the use of the language "paradise" in the third heaven might reflect that certain Greek-oriented Christians started interpreting Paul's reference in Corinthians as maybe that's a place where the dead go.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Because this is written after, this is post-New Testament. Another work, the Testament of Abraham, 1st to 2nd century AD. In this book, there is no resurrection from the dead. There is no future for the earth. Righteous people leave the body, and they leave this world, and they end up in heaven in paradise. So paradise is strictly heavenly with no connection to the earth, and the earth and body have no future, which is the cartoon view.
Right, exactly.
The Testament of Job, also probably in the 2nd century AD. Job and his kids go to heaven after they die. Job's body remains in the tomb, but his soul ascends to heaven. Interestingly, Elihu, in this book, who is an oddball in the book of Job, is associated with Satan. And, he goes to Hades. So Hades in this book is a place where the people associated with Satan go. But Job and his family members ascend and go to heaven. There is no talk at all of a bodily resurrection or a future for the earth. Throughout the book of Job, the earth is constantly spoken of pejoratively. So Hades is only for bad people now, and heaven is for good people.
Sounding very Greek, very Hellenistic.
So maybe more cartoon again.
Right.
And maybe this is the other side of the cartoon. We never talk about, like, sometimes in cartoons, the character dies and gets horns and goes down to the land where the pitchfork is.
Exactly. You see that on a regular basis.
So last book to throw into the hopper is The Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah. This is a composite work. It makes it complicated. Part of it is earlier than the first century AD. Part of it is at the end of the first century AD, and part of it's into the second century AD. this book clearly shows Gnostic influence, right? And that's not a compliment.
Exactly.
It has a very low view of the world. It affirms that, well, it denies that Jesus was actually born. He just appeared next to Mary. He never came out of Mary's womb. In addition, just to show the Gnostic elements, Mary never actually breastfed Jesus. She fake breastfed him so people wouldn't get on to the fact that the divine God is here. And so this is a view that denies the humanity of Jesus.
Yeah.
So this is the book we're talking about, or the part of this book denies the deity of Jesus. So this book also speaks of 7 heavens. God is only in the 7th heaven, and each heaven is better than the heaven before it. It's like you ascend up to the higher heavens, which is a key feature of Gnosticism and its view of salvation. At the second coming, the dead spirits in the 7th heaven return. Oh, yeah. So also in the 7th heaven, I should say, the righteous, when they die, their spirits go to be with God in the 7th heaven. And then it gets weird. At the second coming, the dead spirits in the 7th heaven return with Christ to reunite with those who are alive, to greet them as they leave their bodies behind and join them in the 7th heaven. So Christ comes down with the saints, grabs the people who are alive, takes them out of their bodies, and they all go back to heaven. And
Reverse resurrection.
Yeah, there's more. Only the wicked experience resurrection from the dead. And that's so they can be destroyed forever.
Got to have a body so it can be continually destroyed.
Yeah. So
It sounds like an attempt to reconcile the Thessalonians passage.
yes.
I mean, really, it's not, I don't think it's a good interpretation of it, but it sounds like that's what it is. It's an attempt to reconcile that. Like, this is how it actually works, because Paul didn't give us enough information.
Yeah.
Intriguing.
So with all that out there, Ron, now if you want to maybe, because it got even weirder, right?
Right, yeah.
The further you got on, you got to see Christian interpretation
Right.
going in different directions, but merging Christian views with some Greek views.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you definitely see that really begin to come into full bloom in the 2nd century as, in earlier times you had a guy like Philo who was trying to reconcile Jewish views with Greek philosophy, and he was in Alexandria. It's intriguing to me that anything that's coming that we can definitively say is coming out of Alexandria seems to represent a more Greek kind of a view. But then you have 2nd century and on, that's where Gnosticism begins to flourish. And again, you see a lot of influence from a Greek way of thinking, a low view of the body, low view of the world. The soul or the spirit or whatever you want to call it is free when it's taken from the body. So it shouldn't be surprising that certain Gnostic or other maybe marginal Christian writings are going to reflect that kind of thinking. But yeah, there certainly is a diversity of views there. And so the question becomes, which of those views can we put on a continuum or a trajectory that goes into, through, and out of the New Testament that might help us to understand how the afterlife is viewed by the New Testament writers, how the word paradise is used by Luke/Jesus, Paul, and 2 Corinthians. Those are the questions that come into my mind.
Yeah. And I do want to put a disclaimer on, we're using Greek as almost like it's a swear word. This is not saying that all things Greek are bad.
Right.
And I mean, the New Testament was written in Greek.
Depending on how you view Matthew.
And the gospel went forth in a Greco-Roman culture,
Right.
and they had to, contextually present the gospel to Greeks who have Greek mindsets and mentalities. And so there's nothing wrong necessarily with Greek culture as a whole. And Greek culture and Greek philosophy is not uniform.
Right.
We're strictly talking about here a version of Platonic, not neo at this point, but middle Platonic thought. Aristotle was also Greek, and he didn't have the body-soul dualism in quite the same way, and he affirmed this world and not the dualism of the upper world and the lower world. So there is Greek that's not middle Platonic during this time period.
Right.
Interestingly, that's thriving more among the Arabs at this time.
That's interesting.
It makes a comeback later during Thomas Aquinas' day. Anyway,
Yeah. Greek. all things Greek are not terrible, and who doesn't like a good lamb gyro?
Oh, love me a euro.
So, like, they're not all bad, just mostly.
Excellent point.
I do
So-
what I can.
Spanakopita.
So, in trying to answer Chuck's question, and think about what is Paul saying when he talks about he knows a guy who was caught up in a vision to see the third heaven. One, we're not told anything of what he saw there,
Right.
and so we don't know that he saw. Oh, there are souls there waiting.
Yeah.
He calls it paradise, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But the references for paradise, it's kind of like it could be the notion that paradise being the Garden of Eden, and the garden is kind of hidden from humanity since the fall, that maybe the Garden of Eden is stored in the third heaven. God's kind of has it there in a safe place so that when the new heavens and new earth and the new Jerusalem descends, the new paradise descends with it.
Yeah.
It could be that he's seeing the place that's being prepared for us. That no one's there in yet.
Yeah.
That the thief on the cross isn't going to experience until the resurrection from the dead.
Right.
There are lots of ways to interpret and connect these dots.
Yeah, and it assumes that every time the word paradise is used, it's used to refer to the exact same thing. We've already seen evidence that paradise can refer to the Garden of Eden, which was situated on earth. It can refer to perhaps God's heavenly dwelling. It can also refer to a place on the restored earth, where human beings are going to be, their habitation. So paradise might be a flexible, multi-use, sort of Swiss Army knife type word that might refer to different things in different contexts.
But it never refers to God's dwelling in heaven until Gnostic sources.
Okay.
That comes later. That's not before the New Testament books were written. So using that as a background,
Right, yeah.
I'm
point.
nervous about doing that chronologically.
Yes, and that's a fair point.
Yeah, before the New Testament writers, it's restricted to the garden, I think. And its location is a mystery to all.
Yeah, we've got a ton of passages to get to, but I'm just fascinated by you have the seven heavens thing, but it's located as a place of punishment. So it seems like that's not what he's referring to, but there does seem to be this level of heaven that Paul's engaging in. But now maybe he's redefining what each level is. It's just, I don't know, it's fascinating. I don't think we have an answer to it, but it's just very interesting to consider that he's seeing levels of heaven, or he's picking that up from the apocryphal literature.
Yeah, and in none of the multi-heaven level books that we have access to is God in any of the levels but the seventh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So if anyone's in the third heaven, it's not like they're with God.
Right.
If they're if Jesus is at the right hand of God, he's in the seventh heaven. So if humans are in the third heaven, well, they're not where Jesus is, but they're in a storage place less than where God is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is different than to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord,
Right.
because that would be in the seventh heaven.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and we also have to consider the genre of our sources. You already alluded to this, John, but some of the sources, including biblical ones like Revelation, they're apocalyptic. In other words, apocalyptic literature uses word pictures and imagery that most definitely isn't meant to be taken literally. It uses word pictures to communicate a specific truth. And so I think one of the references we're going to talk about is the souls underneath the altar in Revelation. We have to be careful how much theological freight we put on that for defining where people go after they die, because this is in the context of an apocalyptic vision. And is it meant to be understood literally? Do we use that as a piece of evidence? What counts as actual evidence for us to try to come to some sort of a baseline? And yeah, an apocalyptic type source like Revelation or an extra biblical source might not be one of the best things that we should use.
And that's a great segue, Ron. You use the baseline language.
Did I?
Let's go to.
Did I do good?
Let's go to some
Finally.
non-apocalyptic, non-totally ambiguous passages to some relatively clear, straightforward passages that are not apocalyptic
I feel so good.
and are kind of normative and baseline. So, Sam, can you read John 5, verses 25 to 29?
Sure. Very truly I tell you, the hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not be astonished at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and will come out, and those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation.
Yeah. I mean, this is just a baseline teaching from the words of Jesus about the future. How would you characterize this passage in light of the four views that we've looked at?
I would say it's pretty Daniel-y. The idea they're in the grave, and then as Daniel said, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting contempt. And that's what he's saying here, that they will be raised from the graves, and they'll come out, those who've done good to the resurrection of life, those who've done evil to the resurrection of condemnation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's no real comment on any kind of a soul or spirit independent of the body. It just says the dead are in the grave, which is, I don't know, to me is a little Sheol-like or Hades-like. So yeah, you got the dead in the grave, and they will, up from the grave, they will arise.
Yeah. And it's pretty straightforward. And in the Old Testament, the word for grave and Sheol are used synonymous. Right? Those words are used synonymously. Here, we could think of it as the tomb, but Jesus may have meant that in a richer sense. We can't be positive, but at least we know in the Old Testament they're used synonymously, and that was Jesus' Bible. Another passage that is pretty much straightforward and trying to explain the afterlife, and probably the one that gives the most detail, is 1 Corinthians 15.
Agreed.
Do you want to lead out with that one, Ron, and read from? There's a bunch there to read.
Yeah, it's a long passage. And I don't think we want to read the entire thing. It's an extremely long chapter. Just real quick, as a lead into it, Paul says in 15:3, I handed on to you as first importance what I had received, that Christ has died for sins, buried, and rose from the dead on the third day. He's here to talk about the resurrection and the importance of the resurrection. And so for Paul, this is central to what we believe and to what we look forward to. Now, in verse 12, he says, if Christ is proclaimed raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? And I think we're going to talk about why some of the people in Corinth think there isn't. We'll address that. But he says, if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ hasn't been raised. And if Christ hasn't been raised, then our proclamation has been in vain, and your faith has been in vain. We've been misrepresenting God. And so Jesus' resurrection is central. But then he goes on in verse 20, in fact, if Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have died. For since death came through a human being, the resurrection of the dead has come through a human being. For all die in Adam. So we will all be made alive in Christ, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then at his coming, those who belong to Christ. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he's destroyed every ruler and every authority and every power. He must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And so here is the pattern. Christ rises from the dead. That's central to the proclamation of the gospel. If you say there's no resurrection, well, the gospel we're proclaiming is a lie, because that's all we say about Jesus. But Jesus' resurrection is a promise of our resurrection, that our ultimate hope as believers is to rise from the dead. And when Jesus returns, that will be the point at which that takes place. And I think Paul affirms that in places like 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation has been in vain and your faith is in vain. I mean, if there is no resurrection, if we don't rise from none of it is worth it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. All this whole lose your life to gain it, forget about it.
Exactly.
If we don't rise from the dead, which I think is true if death is final until the resurrection. But if I die and get to be with Jesus, I don't know. Was it worth it? Mm-hmm. Do I need a resurrection for running the race to be in vain if I die and I go to be with Jesus when I die? Arguably, that would be a happy outcome.
Right.
To die and be forever with Jesus. Why do you need a resurrection when your true self is already with Jesus in heaven? I think the force of Paul's argument of our faith is in vain if we are not raised is that the state that we are in before our resurrection isn't worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And that's what he says in 2 Corinthians when he says that our desire is not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed. And again, I think he's responding to that Platonic idea that the spirit is set free when it's released from the body, and it enters into a paradise-like state. I don't know if that's a word that the Platonists would use. But you enter into this state of freedom and joy. And I don't think Paul is saying that at all. I think that what he's saying is, no, that's not what we want. That's not our hope. My suspicion, the Bible doesn't say this explicitly, but my suspicion is that the body with the soul, if there's an existence apart from the body, and that's what we're debating here, but if that is the case, it's not a happy existence. That the soul is yearning to be reunited to the body. That we're looking forward to that resurrection. It's like, this is not right. Get me back to my body. I'm naked. I want my clothes on.
Yeah. So let's go further in 1 Corinthians to talk about the details he gives about the resurrection body, and he gives us some chronology. What happens first? What happens second? Want to pick up, Sam, in verse 35?
But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Fool! When you sow, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you do not sow the body that is to be, but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. Not all flesh is alike, but there is one flesh for human beings, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. But there are both heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is one thing, and that of the earthly is another. There is one glory for the sun, another glory for the moon, another for the stars. Indeed, stars differ from stars in glory, etc. So it is with the So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, then there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, the man of the dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we will also bear the image of the man of heaven. What I'm saying, if you're not confused already, brothers and sisters,
here's the bottom line and the payoff.
Is this: flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Listen, I'll tell you a mystery. We will not all die, but we will all be changed. It's the motto of nurseries. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable body must put on imperishability, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When this perishable body puts on imperishability, then this mortal body puts on immortality, then the saying that is written will be fulfilled. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? That good?
Great. So here, I mean, I think there's lots to clarify here. I mean, this language of heavenly body is not talking about heavenly human body versus
right.
An earthly human body. The heavenly body he's talking about, he unpacks as the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? That's one kind of body. He says, but of humans, we come in two types, perishable and imperishable. And our life on this earth, in this world right now, we have perishable bodies. And when we die, that perishable body is like a seed that is planted in the grave. And then, mysteriously, Christ will appear at the second coming, and what was sown into the ground, perishable, is raised imperishable.
Amen.
And that is the hope that we look forward to. And it should be noted, I mean, he's arguing here against, or at least he's in conversation with a church in Corinth that is wrestling with some ideas about spiritual versus physical, and they have a low view of physical bodies, so much so that they even suggest that people shouldn't have intercourse because it's to enjoy a bodily pleasure. And Paul has to argue, no, there's no reason to be anti-body. It's perhaps the same low view of the body that has him saying, hey, we are going to get a body, but don't worry, it's not going to have all the defects of the current body, but it's still a body. It's still a physical embodied presence The difference is not that it doesn't have skin, it doesn't enjoy food, it isn't physical. The difference is it doesn't perish. What we have now is fading away. The resurrection body will last forever. Is that a fair assessment, Ron?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's abundant evidence that, at least to a degree, a certain segment of the Corinthian population must have had some connection with philosophic teaching, being associated with philosophical schools. I think the factions you see in Corinth are a reflection of the fact that some of the people in the Corinthian church are still holding on to ideas that they inherited from their former way of life. They're thinking like not only Greeks or Gentiles, but people who have had a measure of engagement with philosophical ideas. And in the book of Acts, when Paul is speaking at Athens, when he loses his audience, it's when he starts talking about the resurrection from the dead. That's when they begin to mock him. And so I think that there's really good evidence to say that people who become followers of Christ, coming out of that kind of philosophical thinking, struggled with the idea of the resurrection. That they probably were thinking, when they hear resurrection, they think almost like in the sense of reincarnation, that you're coming back to the body you left behind. And I don't want to come back to the body I left behind. I definitely want to get away from this body. That's what I want. But I want the body that Paul talks about here in 1 Corinthians. When I read this, I'm like, oh my gosh, come Lord Jesus, come. I want this resurrection. If this is what my body's like, sown in weakness, raised in power, sown in dishonor, raised in glory, bring it on. And if Jesus is our model, you have the vision of, we have Jesus resurrected in the Gospels, apocalyptic, yes, but we still have a vision of Jesus in Revelation, of his glorified self. When John sees him, he sees the Jesus he traveled around with for years here on earth, and he just like falls on his face. And if my resurrection body is going to be even, a tithe of that, a tenth of the glory that Jesus has, then yeah, bring on that body. And I think that's the problem the Corinthians are having, is they don't appreciate what the resurrection is actually going to be. And they're still thinking in very Greek Platonic terms, and they're pushing back against it. And Paul has to correct them. He says, you can't reject the resurrection. It's central to the gospel. It's central to our hope.
Yeah, I would just say that we can make a few observations from this passage. Again, Paul, this is a very extended passage on this subject as opposed to snippets we get in the rest of the New Testament. This is doesn't seem to be allegorical, metaphorical type of language. He seems to be laying out a clear argument. And right there in verse 51, 52, this all happens chronologically when Jesus comes back. That regardless of what you think happens to the body-soul situation, this happens right then. Yep. That this resurrection occurs. We can put that against our four views to talk about which one it lines up with, but I think it rules out a few views, especially more popular ones we see around our world today. And again, we don't get more than this. This is Paul, going as specifically as he can about this topic. And if that's going to be our sort of our baseline passage,
it's a lot like Daniel.
Yeah.
And they're, strikingly absent from this detailed account of what happens is any notion that our soul or our spirit ascends and reunites with our body when our body is raised. The reunion is not talked about here. It's an argument from silence. You could say Paul believed it. He just didn't talk about it in the passage when he went into the most detail about what he believes. But it is strikingly absent, which makes me wonder whether we should interpret his other passages as meaning that. Absence doesn't prove something.
Right, yeah.
It can't prove something,
but
it is conspicuously absent here.
Yeah, and I think somebody might push back and say, well, and in fact, I say somebody, this is my thought. The reason it's conspicuously absent is it might be just outside the scope of what he's trying to accomplish. If he's trying to emphasize the centrality of the resurrection, and especially with regard to Jesus, because his whole point is if you deny resurrection of any sort, you deny the core of the gospel, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. The question of what happens to a person post-mortem, after death but before the resurrection, he might be silent on it just because it's outside the scope of what he's trying to accomplish rhetorically. So yeah, you're right. We have to be careful arguing from silence. It just might not be germane.
Yeah. So this is a baseline. There's no baseline text without a lot of ambiguity in it that teaches the reunion view.
Yeah.
The reunion view can be inferred from some of the ambiguous passages that can go in one or two different directions.
Sure.
Right.
But we know a resurrection from the dead on the last day to an imperishable body is the Christian hope.
Right.
That much is clear on the new heavens and new earth. And one thing we didn't look at this week that I think we're going to save for another week is all the passages that talk about the future of this world as a hope, both of the Old Testament and the New Testament, because that's going to be a part of the next view we view. We're following along, endangered gospel, and this is an evaluation of the heaven-centered view,
right,
that our hope is to die and go to heaven.
Yeah.
And I think this study has made clear that the Christian hope is not to die and go to heaven. The Christian hope is to raise from the dead.
Right.
Yeah.
In a new physical body in a restored and glorified earth. That is the Christian hope. Now, what happens in between with the soul, we have not gotten a clear word from the New Testament, such that it should not be how we articulate our hope.
Right. I agree with that 100%. We can debate whatever the intermediary state might be, even if there is or isn't one, and if there is, what it might be. We could debate that. But to reinforce your point, John, I would affirm that 100%. Our ultimate hope is the resurrection. Our ultimate hope is not to ascend into heaven and live with God in heaven for all eternity as a disembodied spirit. It's not the cartoon version. It is the resurrection, a new heavens, and a restored, renewed earth on which the resurrected people are going to live. Yeah, that is our hope. And that means our ultimate sort of values and objectives have to align with our ultimate hope. Resurrection, renewed earth.
Yeah. And, as far as coming back to our four views, I think, what about the split grave view? And there's a weakness in the split grave view, although it may be a lens to view the rich man and Lazarus. It could be a lens to view even Today with Me in Paradise, if paradise is a split part of the grave. One problem with that view, and we haven't brought up any of these passages, is the whole notion of Judgment Day.
Right.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Judgment Day happens when, according to the Bible?
When Jesus returns.
When Jesus returns. When are the sheep and the goats separated?
Yeah, when he returns.
When Jesus returns.
Right.
So if you have a split grave, or if you having the righteous people die and their souls to be with Jesus, when the wicked people are not also dying to be with Jesus, then you have Judgment Day happening at death.
Right.
And the biblical teaching on Judgment Day is wrong. That, to me, is a pretty huge tension that I'm not sure I want to live with.
Yeah.
Right.
And I can't help but wonder if the Bible is deliberately ambiguous with regard to whatever the state after death might be, in between death and the resurrection. Maybe that's on purpose because, again, as we've already pointed out, God doesn't want us thinking in those terms. He wants to give us just enough information to know He's got us covered. When I die, whatever happens, God's got me covered. And ultimately, at some point in the future, at least according to the space-time continuum in which we live, a little Star Trek-y there, I'm going to be resurrected from the dead, and that's going to be awesome. And I can't wait for that day. And so whatever view you have, let's not argue too much about it. Let's just get excited about the fact that, number one, God's got us covered because we acknowledge we live under the lordship of His Son, Jesus Christ, and that we're really looking forward to that resurrection body.
Yeah, amen. And that sets us up, I think, for next week to consider the next view. If the purpose of the church is not to take people to another place after they die, is it to make this world a better place? What is the biblical case for that? And we've had conversations outside of class with fellow faculty members on the urge in our society to make this world a better place. If it's not to go to heaven after we die, is it to fix this world.
Yeah.
So get your thinking caps going on that, especially thinking about passages that might be relevant to that. But I think that wraps up this week's episode of the After Class podcast.
Because
The best conversations happen
after
After
class.
class.